Hi, this is I'm Jill Clifton of Landscape of Mothers, and I'm here today talking with my friend Sunny Lindley, who is also a parenting coach and runs a program called um, oh my God, I'm blanking.
The Family Crest program.
Family Crest. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. My
Okay.
brain was spinning on to the next thing already. Yeah, so Sunny and I have started doing a couple of videos. You may have seen others. And these are all what we're doing right now is a series of relatively short conversations, hopefully, about questions that I received when I ran a series called Ask the Mothers, where I invited people to ask me parenting questions or, how to organize around parenting kind of things. And then I answered them based on Landscape of Mothers. And so now I'm here sharing that with Sunny and the perspective from her program, the Family Crest. Hi. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks
Yeah,
so much for helping organize this, Jill.
of course. This is my favorite thing ever. So just getting to talk about parenting, right? There's no one right way. The
Yep.
easiest thing to do in a lot of ways is explore, right? So that's what we're doing is
Hmm.
exploring what's possible. So today's question, I'm just going to kind of read it. Somebody wrote in saying, I'm struggling with feeling like I missed my prime years chasing after unrealistic goals. Sometimes I want to just throw it all away, but I'm exhausted by shifting course so many times already. How do I be content? How do I push through when I'm exhausted spiritually? How do I find joy again and hope for a better future? That's a pretty big question. Um, but we can start with that sense that I think might be really common in parenting where we have children and they really do like change the course of everything and we do start altering and big things that we don't expect can happen, right?
Um,
And so what do we do when we feel like we just keep heading out in a million different directions? It gets overwhelming.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah. I can really relate to what the author of that question is saying. Especially, I was a mother really, really young, and
Mhm.
I felt very ready to become a mother. Like I didn't have any doubts whatsoever about my choice to become a mother. Um, but I definitely didn't get like the typical sort of teen years to just like the early teen and early 20s years to just like really explore a whole bunch of different things. I just kind of launched right into motherhood and it became my identity really quickly. And so there was points in my own journey where I definitely was like, is this even what I want? Like, what am I doing? Um, this doesn't really even feel meaningful to me. Um, and so I think some of that, I don't know the age of the person who asked this, but some of
Yeah.
it can just be very developmental. Like if you're in your 20s, it's perfectly reasonable. Like that's the thing you're doing developmentally is trying to figure out your purpose in the world and how to apply your love as an action. And when we don't become parents and we're in our 20s, I think I usually like to encourage people to explore a lot and try a whole bunch of different things. And I usually tell people don't stay committed and don't let anybody judge you for like choosing a different path numerous times. Like I was just advising a young woman who's probably 22 that was staying with me for the last 4 or 5 days. And she was like, my parents can pay for me to go to college and I want to go to college, but I'm not really sure that college is the right path for me. I'm not sure what I wanted, what I want to study exactly. And after we got through the question of like, because first I was saying, well, don't go to college if it's going to put you in a whole bunch of debt because, that's a huge thing for some. And it definitely was a rough experience for me. But if your parents are paying for college, then my suggestion was just pick a major that feels good to you right now, and then just change your major whenever you want. Like follow your passion
Hmm.
because if it's not going to be putting you in a huge amount of debt, and I don't want to underestimate that could potentially create debt for the parents, and I don't want to neglect that, but I think especially for a young woman, it's really important to kind of recognize the nature of women as changers. Like that's what we do. We grow an entire skin in our womb and then we shed that like every single month. Like the nature of us is change. So And I think that's what allows us as parents um, to be able to meet our kids in their constantly changing developmental needs. It really helps us to be able to meet that, the fact that we ourselves are changing all the time to meet the needs of our kids and families and the world and the culture. And um, so, yeah, I just encouraged her to just, pick a major. If it feels juicy, do it. If you want to change your major, just change it, and just don't let others tell you, like, oh, you have to stick with something. You can't change your mind. And because ultimately, if you end up in a career later because you like stuck with it and you were determined to stick with that principle of like having one career choice and following through with that, you can easily end up in something that you really don't like to do. And sometimes you don't know that until you get there, you
Yeah.
know? So that is one piece around that, is just kind of validating that like that is such a normal experience to
Mhm.
feel like um to be questioning, like, am I even doing the right thing? Should I just throw it all away and start new? And, what does that mean if I do throw it all away and start new? And um, my thoughts on it are that I think that I'm not into forcing ourselves to do things that we don't love. And we love our kids, so we're going to stay committed to our kids. And what we need to do for our kids might not always be fun, but I wouldn't say that that's one of those things where you're like, not doing what you love, because you love your kids. And so
Right.
that piece doesn't apply as much, you know what I mean, as it does to like a college choice, for instance.
Right.
Um, and you can move your family to a different town. You can, move into a smaller house, move into a bigger house. Like there's a lot of options that we can do for raising our families. Like
Mhm.
my son right now, he's raising his family mostly in a transit van and, traveling around playing music, and they're a pretty healthy, happy family. It's not a traditional lifestyle, but it's one that really works for them. And that's great. So we can radically change our lives, even with families. Having kids doesn't keep us from doing that.
Right.
So I'm curious, like, to ask you, Jill, like in that question, if um and it might be helpful to like repeat the question, but I'm trying to like tune in with what the feeling is, because her question has
Yeah.
many parts,
Right.
but the underlying feeling is what? It's like I don't
I
feel secure in I don't feel passionate about any of the one things that I'm doing, and I'm afraid to change. It's something like that, and be helpful to reread it, and then I'd be curious to know, which of the mothers in Landscape of Mothers can really inform that feeling state that that
Okay.
mom is in.
So the question, just to reiterate, was I'm struggling with feeling like I missed my prime years chasing unrealistic goals. Sometimes I want to throw it all away, but I'm exhausted by changing course so many times already. That was the first half of it that we're kind of tuning into. What I hear in that question, well, first of all, I hear a lot of judgment. So I think there's a comparison going on between what this person is doing, what they think they should be doing. And I'm deeply curious about what that is. Like, what are they measuring themselves against?
Yeah,
Because I suspect it's by some sort of amorphous standard, right? There's our cultural dialogue is very filled, and again right now in a lot of ways with these the current political climate, and talking about what women are up to and supposed to be up
right,
to,
right.
that there's some kind of standard that either she's internalized or is hearing about, that makes her feel like what she's doing isn't right. And I agree with you totally that, this is, in some ways, there's appropriate times to kind of put on blinders and kind of do what you need to do. And I agree that I think we tend to, as a culture, we tend to expect mothers to give themselves up for their children's needs. And while to some degree that's true, and we do, there's another part where I think it's really important that we also hold on to some piece of ourselves. So I agree with you completely of like, that there is a need to tend to yourself and what you're passionate about and what you love, because it's easier to do what we love, even
Yeah.
when that thing gets hard, as inevitably it does.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd be curious about what her comparison sense is, um, um, and why that's something she feels like she should be doing instead of what she is doing.
Yeah, it definitely, for me, it kind of smacked of the basic, the old patriarchal narrative of like
Mhm.
that there's a role that moms are supposed to play. And part of that role is being utterly consistent, reliable, not changing, um, so that you can, so that the systems that rely on the free labor of mothers can continue to run business as usual.
Right.
And if a woman is like more clay like and she's sort of like shaping and forming to whatever is like needed in, but in like close connection with her internal fire,
Mhm.
then she's a little bit harder to like control or put into a box or
Mhm.
um, rely on in ways that I think the culture shouldn't be relying on mothers, you know?
Right. Agreed. And I think that, like, even just like to kind of focus it on that person's experience, I think also it's just about like whose expectations are you meeting and whose
Mm.
expectations do you think you're supposed to be meeting? Because I think there's a conflict in there. And
Yeah.
so just I do think it's patriarchy. I do think that there's stuff out there, but if that all feels way too big for like I'm just struggling to make this work,
Mhm.
then just in that basic of like meeting that person right there would be like whose expectations are you trying to meet?
Yeah.
And are these appropriate? Like, do you have the power to meet these people's expectations? And
Right.
really, fundamentally, you really only have the ability to meet your own expectations. And so being able to
Right.
kind of circle back and figure out what that looks like.
Mhm.
So I would say in that realm, it's desert mother around boundaries, like whose expectations am I
Mm.
trying to meet? And then island, that gives island mother a chance for what's true inside of this person to arise so that
Mm.
like they can answer their own question.
Ooh,
Right. Because
say more. Tell me more about Desert Mother.
well, Desert Mother's about boundaries. So in some ways, I like to think of boundaries less as like what we say yes or no to, but more um, setting expectations.
Mhm.
So we can be setting expectations of others. We can set expectations of ourselves. It helps us take responsibility for what's ours. It helps us kind of set down what's not ours to do,
Mhm.
or where we might be trying to affect change where we don't actually have the power to do it, because we can't make people do things.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so Desert Mother I see as being that landscape of, whose expectations am I going after? Whose, obligations, and what feels like an obligation, and does that help me figure out whose expectation this is? Like,
Mhm.
oh, I have to go to a family event. Why do you have to go to that family event? Well, my mom's expecting me. And if I don't go, then she'll tell me all this, stuff, like
Yeah.
whatever. So then you're really meeting your mom's expectations. So instead,
Mm.
you might want to, I mean, people can do whatever they need to do, but there might be like, oh, that helps me understand whose expectations I'm trying to meet.
Yeah.
And then
Can you
once we
say
do
more
that,
about, if you don't mind, I don't mean to interrupt,
no,
but
go
can
ahead.
you say more about like the desert landscape and how that
Mhm.
relates to this kind of a question?
Right. So, um, for me, desert has a lot of like imposition, right? There's a lot of sun, there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of intensity. And so, animals and plants that live in the desert have figured out how to, like, under what conditions they can live or thrive. And they have figured out how to alter their behaviors and their physiology in order to um, make it work for them, right? So they're really on the
Yeah.
edges of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's we can look to any of the inhabitants of that kind of a landscape for like, oh, there's rest, there's retreat, there's ways to behaviorally like not be inside of that intensity. There's resources, and I can know where they're going to come and when they're going to come to some degree, and I can store them, or And so we can look to that for some parallels as we're saying, like, oh, if my energy is going to meet other people's expectations, I'm really living in a landscape that I'm going to get parched, right? I'm
Yeah.
not going to end up having
Well, and
resources.
that's what she says in that question is she
Right.
says, and I can't remember exactly how she said it, but she said, how can I, how can I meet, she speaks about the demands, like how can I push through is what she
Yeah.
says. How can I push through
When
when I'm
exhausted spiritually.
exhausted? Yeah, and my immediate reaction to that was, well, you don't.
Don't.
But
Right. Mine
when I
too.
hear what you're saying about the desert landscape, what I hear is um, you find shade when shade is needed at an appropriate time of the day, and then you maybe come out at night and you develop night vision. Like
Mhm.
there's adaptations. Um, it isn't always an option to just say, well, you just don't, right? Because it's like, I think about the time, for instance, when my son had Tourette's, and like if I was saying, if somebody said to me when I was like, how do I push through? Like, I'm trying to help my kid with Tourette's. And he's having all these troubles in school, and my partner is also like not having a job, and I'm having to earn all the money. And it's like, you feel all this pressure to like make everything work. And if someone was like, well, you just don't. I'd be like, that's not an option, girl. Like, what are
Right.
you saying? Can you acknowledge the difficulty of my experience?
Right.
I'm living
Yeah.
in a hot, arid, crazy desert, and it's like, and I'm exhausted and worn out. And so I love that landscape um, example shows us that there's a lot of different options. Like, how does a lizard, navigate a desert landscape? How does a 500-year-old tree, like what is it doing to be able to survive in those conditions? Like what are the ways to adapt?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And a way of sorting sort of, what's possible, what's mine, right? Like, and what's my responsibility. And in the desert, it just becomes really apparent that survival um is, is the goal.
Mhm.
And so it very much comes down to that protection and nourishment that I think
Yeah.
in a lot of realms things do, but in desert particularly, in that in that
And that makes
environment,
me
it's
think of the way that in the desert, there's typically like water reservoirs.
Mhm.
And, like it is a dry and arid climate, but there'll be these places where if you dig down enough, there's a reservoir. There'll be cactuses that hold moisture inside them, and you can cut them and find more moisture. Like, and so it makes me think for, this dear mother who has this question. It's like, where is your reservoir?
Mhm.
Like,
Right.
almost none of the other questions even matter until you figure
Right.
out where is your reservoir,
Mhm.
and how can you build in more time to replenish yourself at that reservoir before you even make any decisions. And that's that sorting piece that you're talking about with boundaries. It's like that in order to get some time to enjoy the reservoir, you kind of have to be like no, and
Right.
then your no leads to some of the yeses that
Mhm.
are necessary to become regenerated.
Yeah. For me, I think we're hitting like on the crux of the question, because the other thing I heard inside of these is like, I'm having these feelings, this discomfort around having a bunch of avenues. And right now I just want to trash the one I'm on, and I just feel overwhelmed. And like none of this is going where I want it to go.
Hmm.
And then the following questions felt like urgent, right?
Yeah.
How do I be content? How do I push through when I'm exhausted spiritually? How do you find joy in the job again? How do I hope for a better future? Right? It was like,
Mhm.
I want to go from being right here where I'm uncomfortable. And it totally makes sense, right? Like, all we want is the
Yeah.
solution when things are hard. But sometimes the solution is in this pause or in this ability to find that reservoir.
Yeah.
And then the things that we're looking for have room, right,
Yeah.
to grow or to be seen or noticed and felt. And
Mm.
that's how we know where to go. And often I think I never wanted that answer
Yeah.
when I was struggling when my kids were really little, and
Oh,
I was
I
like,
know.
you know,
Yeah,
I
you
mean,
don't
it
want
doesn't make it
someone to
less
tell you
true or
like, just
anything.
meditate, just like go
Right.
deep into your quiet space and like It's like, you don't want to hear that when you're extremely overwhelmed and everything is actually urgent. And yet, I think that it is true. And it's also a seemingly impossible task to
Right.
accomplish in the culture that we live in the culture that moms are trying to raise kids in.
Mhm.
It's, it isn't impossible, but it's seemingly impossible, you
Right.
know?
It feels impossible for sure. And I
Yeah.
think that's because that urgency, that pressure to do to take action is so
Yep.
prevalent in our society. So again, we kind of zoom back out to that bigger picture, but
Hmm.
everybody wants us to be productive and everybody wants us to just be on task and,
Right.
like, and if you're not, you're lost or you're lazy, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. I don't know, all of those things that probably run through our own minds.
Yeah.
Um, so
I have
what
a
do we
thought
do?
about Well, I have a thought about that because I'm
Okay.
remembering some of those times in my own parenting life. And for those who don't know me already that are listening, I raised three kids on my own after their dad died. And there was definitely many times when I was unbelievably extremely overwhelmed and exhausted. Um, and I had to prioritize. And I'm so grateful for that being a message that my dad sent all through my childhood. He used to tell me how important it was to know your priorities. And anytime I would call him crying or, upset or whatever, he would often go back to that. Well, know your priorities, Sonny. Like what is the thing that is the highest priority, right? And so for me, it was about spending enough time like in therapy and coaching types of environments to be able to have all these great tools to analyze and understand what my values are. And from the place of my values, then I could decide on my priorities. So in a moment of crisis like that, what I would do is my highest priority is taking care of the living things. So if I have a list, if I did a brain dump, let's say, and I just wrote down like all the things that are on my mind that I feel like screaming at my husband about, or I feel like yelling at my kids about because I'm so stressed out. If I just write them all down and then I would go through that list and I would mark the ones that a life could be harmed if I didn't do this one. And that didn't just include like one of my children or if the power got shut off that could impact lives, right? So that would kind of go to the top of the list, but also included things like house plants, pets, and things like that, because I think when we are fostering life, we are in the reservoir. It's like that reservoir is, we're in the flow of that reservoir anytime we're fostering life, and that includes our own life. And so prioritizing life affirming, life giving things first always is where I would start. And then after doing that list of priorities, then I might go down to the next priorities, which would be the things that are secondary to fostering life, right? So, like the power bill, that would be actually secondary. Like, first, I'm going to feed my kids, I'm going to water my houseplants if they're about to die, I'm going to feed the animal, or if the animal needs to get to the vet, that's a higher priority than paying the power bill, actually, like, because it's life. And then those things that foster life, like being able to have power, or if you're just really generally running out of money, like you kind of have to have money to foster life. So that falls into that category too. And then I would start to work on those. And I'd work my way down the list based on what my values are. And that could be different for any person. And then I would say the second thing is always add people. So it's whatever, if you're feeling overwhelmed, most things will be made less overwhelming by adding a helper. If you have a good friend who can listen to you, who can problem solve with you, who can just be present while you cry about it or bitch about it, but especially friends who like really know what it's like to be in your shoes and who can show up the way that you've often shown up for me. And I try to show up for you, where it's like, what's going on? How do you want to be supported? And what is one action thing that I can do And what is an action thing you can do that I could support you in? Like, and that's all part of like, how would you like to be supported? Because sometimes we just need to vent. Sometimes we actually need to problem solve and we're too emotional to do that.
Mhm.
And sometimes we actually need to like ask for a huge gift, or we need to like just get the heck out of our house, like leave the environment for a while. It's lots of different things that we could potentially need at a given time. And one of my favorite questions among friends is, how would you like to be supported?
Mhm.
And so it would be the priorities, which are rooted in your values, and then always adding more help. It's like Jen Lemon says, if it's easy, do it now. If it's hard, do it together.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree in a really practical sense. I feel like that's golden advice. Just in terms of, right. Often that venting, I think, is that part where this feels impossible. And in a systems way, it's often borderline impossible to do what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And then also to find the little cracks in there of like um, where we can take steps. And I think adding helpers is always great. And I like the way you put that because I hear people sometimes saying, well, just ask for help. And asking for help somehow is this supercharged thing, but
Right.
adding people seems like this neutral thing, right? Like
Right.
adding the appropriate people who can move into the space and
Mhm.
um, can ask you what could be most helpful or um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And sometimes that can just be sending, like I had to learn personally to like send a text message to a friend who
Mhm,
I know loves and cares about me and be really specific about what I need. Like,
mhm,
can you please call me as soon as you're able because I'm in crisis? And can you please ask me how I would like to be supported? And because that's what I'm needing from a friend right now,
mhm,
And it felt really awkward to do that initially, but I found that the more often I did that and I was really specific, the more of a beautiful like culture of mutual aid I started to develop around me. And every time I did that, it gave that friend permission to call me and be that specific and do the same.
mhm,
And once we worked through the awkwardness of being so direct, when women are so often told not to be so direct, right? Once you work through that awkwardness, it was like, oh my gosh, did like the life affirming support and community start to just really unfold. And
mhm.
that started to feel like that the little pockets of water in the desert, you know?
Right. Um, Yeah, I think when my kids were really little, I know that I've heard other people say too that they feel like this, that but I don't have anyone to ask.
Yep.
I don't have anybody to reach out to. And so
Hmm.
I would just add to that, and especially because she specifically said like I'm exhausted spiritually.
Yeah.
Some of that when I there's multiple ways to be together, right? So there's being together with other folks, which is sort of like horizontal to me, right? And then
Hmm.
there's vertical being together, which would be like either into like rooting into the ground, into the land, and
Hmm.
finding that way of feeling support and feeling connected with
Hmm.
maybe some of the more than human world, right? That
Yeah.
there's trees there, they've been standing there a long time. And often when I get around trees and I just really feel into them, so I can feel that sense of just like some of that urgency drops away and some of that um, overwhelm starts to drop away, right? It kind of just drains down into the ground. And so just giving ourselves some time there can be good. Um,
Yeah.
and and
Like
then
the trees
also
have
I
these
think,
deep roots and they're reaching down into those reservoirs and they're
right,
pulling it up. And yeah.
right. And so, and that also, I think, then in Landscape of Mothers world, that takes you from desert, which is on one side of the wheel, over to forest, which is the balancing side of the wheel. Desert would be very individual, right? There's sort of a whole side of the wheel of Landscape of Mothers and the way that they're organized. That's like really our individual stuff. And I
Mhm.
think getting caught on one side is one of those ways that we end up both overwhelmed and isolated. And
Mhm.
so by doing something like connecting with earth and connecting with trees and the more than human world, we start to orient ourselves a little more back to the other side of the wheel, like toward forest mother, our
Mm.
connections and our depth and our ability, right? Yeah, to pull things up out of the ground and offer them, right?
Yeah.
So we reorient completely from
Mm.
what's overwhelming us, even though the situation, to the eyes looks the same.
Wow. So in Landscape of Mothers, there's like a wheel that has all of the different landscapes. And when you're working with one landscape in order to sort of find the healing in that landscape, it's almost like a mirror to another landscape. Like, or maybe that's not the right way to say
Yeah.
it, but it's like when you work with the principles of that landscape,
Hmm.
then it kind of can help you to evolve into the mirroring landscape,
Hmm.
kind of like that.
Well, or it's the balancing landscape. So, like when we were talking about desert, it's very much like, what are my expectations? What are other people's expectations? And we're doing this sort of boundary issue of like, what's mine? What am I going to take responsibility for? As in, what am I going to do? What am I going to take action on? What am I going to like pick up the mantle on? Which would include like your values and things. But then there's also this like that stuff, while you in some ways you sort it out somewhat alone, uh sometimes, or like you're the one who decides. Ultimately it comes down to you deciding what's true for you. But then there's also this like putting it into action and being in community with it that goes over to the other side of more of a forest mother community kind of thing.
Mhm.
There are ways that we can end up bouncing kind of back and forth between those, and one of the beauties of Landscape of Mothers is that usually I organize the wheel with sun and moon in the middle. And so there's an odd number of mothers around the outside, which means
Mm.
that for every one mother, there's two across from it.
Oh.
So that instead of being bouncing in a binary, there's always a third leg to the stool kind of
Mm.
thing that
I
helps
love
balance
that.
things out and
Yeah,
gives choices. And I think as soon as you have a choice, I think the brain starts to think of all the other choices you could have. So it's
right.
not that there's only two choices in any given situation, but there's actually a whole plethora of them to
Yeah.
get to start from that place of like of
It
so.
makes me think of, just in a metaphorical sense, and this is part of what I love about our conversations and how Family Crest and Landscape and Mothers are so juicy together, because like metaphorically, like if you're in the desert mother, if you're using like desert as a metaphor for how to navigate that landscape, like a really, really old tree that has made it in the desert, I'm guessing has a really deep taproot,
Mhm,
right? So that makes me think in a really harsh environment where there's extreme sun, extreme wind, extreme temperatures in general, it's dry, that you need a really deep taproot, which to me kind of speaks to having a good spiritual practice.
mhm,
Um, that's what it speaks to for me. And then I'm thinking of, on the other side is the forest. There's usually a lot more moisture available in a forest than there is in a desert landscape, but also the roots are more intertwined with each other because it is a whole forest. So there's communication between the trees in that kind of deeper part of the earth. Um, and just the access to more water is more supported in that landscape. Like that landscape can become a desert
mhm,
if too many of those trees are wiped out, then it becomes a desert. And so I just think those are just some interesting insights to think about. And
mhm,
there's a wheel that I used, that I particularly like to share with people around the, hardest part of the pandemic, that's about trying to prioritize what the needs are of your family or specifically of your children. And it was really helpful when people were trying to decide what to do with regards to schooling. Um, and in that wheel, it's looking at, the outer rings are like your ability to act on larger world things. It's kind of like the self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy or something. And then inside of that is more like your own like job situation and community and cultural activation. And then inside of that is like just your own family. And then inside of that is your own personal well-being and self-care. And then deeper it goes into more like, your values and ability to be effective, to have hope. And then, even deeper is more like I actually put at the very center, because it matches the outside, is like what your cosmology is.
Mm.
Because I like to think of cosmology as not just like like it's some in the stars, ethereal, spiritual way out there kind of a thing, but actually is more like a deep fire inside. And so I like to put the cosmology in both places in the wheel. But I love the way that wheel is like this really practical terms of like, okay, what is the problem that you're having? It's school. Like, where am I going to send my kids to school during a pandemic? Right. And being able to look at all the places on that wheel in in order to make that decision. And many people who were using the wheel at the time would realize that what was going on in their own families and with their own self-care was at a crisis level. And so it really wasn't the right time to even make that decision. It was like actually making a decision about where my kids are going to go to school needs to wait at least 2 weeks, because we need to figure out healthy eating, getting enough sleep, being safe from getting sick, the conflict that's happening because we're all home together all the time. Like, we need to work on those things. And then where we're going to go to school, like that's an outer ring. And that needs to be dealt with after these like more personal things. I
Wow,
love
I
the way
love the
that,
way that it feels like sort of a moving circle of, in and out.
yeah,
And I love the way that like pulls those values and stuff into very specifically into your actions. Like, what are you doing right now? And recognizing where the attention needs to go in all of these possible rings. Right.
right. And going back to this woman's question, if there's how do I push through when I'm completely spiritually exhausted? It was like one of the questions.
Mhm.
And it just makes me think in terms of that wheel that like, um, at what place in the concentric circles should a person be operating at? Because it doesn't make sense to try to change the larger culture when you're having difficulty like affording enough food or whatever.
Right.
Like,
Right.
so, and oftentimes I think when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's because we are looking at all the rings at once, and
Mhm.
we just can't be effective when we're looking at all the rings at once. So it's so necessary to look at those concentric rings and to decide on one problem you're going to work on,
Mhm.
and then ask yourself, that one problem exists in which ring, and in order for me to do something in that ring, I have to be well resourced in all the inner rings if it's an
Right.
outer ring.
Right.
So often often we just need to decide not to solve that problem or to give ourselves more time. Like, one of the things I often say to parents, especially when something feels like it's in crisis, is, change your expectations and expand the timeline.
Yeah.
Like, that's such an important tool when we're overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And that relates to what you were saying about whose expectations is she trying to meet,
Right.
and sometimes it's our own. I know that I could be a bit of a perfectionist as a parent. That tended to show up mostly in how I would keep my home. Like, I wanted things very organized, very clean. It was just one of the ways I managed my own stress, was like I could control my external environment, and that kept me from being a controlling person in my social ways. And so, um, figuring out what you have control over and what you don't. And
Mhm.
um, yeah, kind
Yeah.
of lost my train of thought about what I was saying there, but
Yeah, I think, I mean, in that way of like you know, which of these concentric circles is really, where is the thing I most need to focus on?
Mhm.
That brings up for me, like, again, those expectations kind of, but I think
Mhm.
that's another way to look at this person's question of like, I've gone a lot of directions and I don't know, like none of them seem satisfactory. I'm wondering how much she's been jumping around in those things as opposed
Yeah,
to sticking with something, like finding one of the things that most needs attention, like the priority, and then being able to address that long term. And that might be one way out of all of this. But again, yeah, lower the expectations, widen the time for it is
yep,
really seems like good advice to this, given that we have very limited information.
yeah.
Um, wow, thanks for going through this with me. My short answer on the mama messages part was very different, and I think this is much
Hmm.
more helpful. I mean, I think they're along the same lines, but you know, when we give ourselves the time to really explore a concept or a question, it becomes so much richer. And so
Yeah,
our culture is sort of geared toward those like, you know, 2 to 3 minute time chunks, but
right.
giving this a half hour of really working through it, I hope gave anybody who's listening a chance to figure out like where their little thread would be and to pull that one because we kind of talked about a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. We touched on all kinds of things in there.
Yeah. And I just want to offer this person or whoever resonates with this question, this compassion of, you know, it's, you know, it is impossible in some ways, right? Where women are constantly doing the impossible.
Yeah,
Um, and like you said, we're made of change, right? Like we are the embodiment of change.
yep,
And I think that's, you know, historically, I think that has been told to us as a weakness, but I really think it's a strength. It's an adaptability. And so I really have a lot of hope for this person at the same time that I'm just like, oh, it's impossible. I also want to be like, do it. You know, you got
yeah,
this.
exactly.
So,
Yeah. So many times the thing that we think is a weakness is actually a strength. And, I've been trying to lean in a lot to, like, for instance, when I feel like collapsing and I'm feeling hopeless and I'm just like, oh, it's not worth it or whatever. Like, sometimes I'll not let myself, but I'll encourage myself to actually go all the way there.
mhm.
Like if
Yeah.
I'm feeling like giving up, I'll set a timer for half an hour and be like, you know what? For a half an hour, I am completely giving up.
Mhm.
I'm not entertaining giving up. I'm not considering giving. I'm not complaining about how I want to give up. I'm giving up like completely. What does that look like? And
Yeah.
that might be like falling into a puddle of tears or just being like, forget it. I'm going to drink wine and sit in the bathtub. Like, forget it all. Whatever it is for me that giving up looks like, I'll just go all the way there for just a half an hour. So it's
Mhm.
safe. Like, I know there's an end point,
Right.
and often by just giving myself permission to have the unresourceful feeling,
Mhm.
um, it'll just resolve. It'll
Yeah.
just lift,
I think it opens that door for that inner fire to relight, right? The thing is that inner
Yeah,
fire is getting squished and squished and squished, and it's like it's way too small in here. And I think
yep,
that's why it's sort of like, ah, you know, I want to give up. And like you said, if you're just like, okay, fine, we're giving up, it just opens that door for that flame to get the oxygen that it needs again.
yep,
And so it just comes back. Yeah, I think that's a practice of like not being afraid of like letting the thing unfold.
yeah.
It's like, I mean, I remember worrying like, oh, if I collapse, will I ever get back up?
Exactly,
Um,
exactly. That's where the timer is so helpful.
right. The timer's helpful. And the truth is, I think that we don't very often run that risk in reality that we're not going to get back
Right.
up because our kids are still there and they're going to need dinner. And that's reality. And we're going to
Yep,
get up and we're going to feed them, right? Because that
yep,
tending to life is so important.
yep,
So, and that's one of the things I think that comes back with the flame. I think, you know, most of the time it's okay
yep,
to let ourselves just be there. Yeah.
yep.
And the
Oh,
friend who can reflect it back to you, like, dude, we're doing the impossible, that's also
right.
helpful. Of just like somebody who can kind of be in it with you without pushing you over the edge. Right.
Right.
Um, so that way
Yep.
we can reach out to folks, to friends that we know are sympathetic to where we're at.
Exactly. Yeah, and with that in mind, Jill, I feel like as a way of just kind of modeling, a modeling for moms, like how to cultivate really good friendships, and also just a way of like honoring you in this collaboration that we were doing. I just feel called to like mention that like the way that it became possible for us to do these conversations was through you, through me being able to be really specific about what it would, what kind of support I would need to be able to do this, and you being able to be really specific and show up in the ways that you could. And so, you know, for those folks who are listening, what that meant in this situation was that, you know, Jill and I made this plan. We're like, let's do, you know, we were going to do a support group, which is still something that is going to happen. But it was like, okay, doing the support group isn't going to happen right now. And part of that was because I'm moving. And so I'm in the middle of the biggest move of my life. I've been in my home 17 years and made the decision to sell this place and trying to get into another place that will ultimately be even better for me. But moving a home that you've raised many children in for 17 years is a huge project. And not just the physical work of it, but like the mental load of all the, you know, planning, preparation, decisions to make, all of that is just so much.
Mhm.
And so Jill and I had a conversation about, okay, let's get real. Like, do we need to just set this project aside and not do it at all? Or is there some way that we can do a part of it or do it as a hybrid or like,
Mhm.
you know, and part of that conversation that I think was so beautiful was asking the question of like, well, what part of you, what part of doing the project felt really juicy and it was going to really like make you feel more alive and make you feel like progress was happening, and then what part of it felt like obligations
Mhm.
and just like duty or whatever. And we decided that whatever our answer was for both of us of the part that just felt really yummy, like we're going to go with that, we're not going to go with the obligation part. And coming from that place, we were able to come up with a strategy where it could still happen. And in this case, that means that Jill is actually, because I'm in the chaotic move, you know, Jill is actually like, you know, the one who's like creating the Zoom room and recording the call and um, coming to these conversations with the questions already laid out. And you know, she's doing the introduction and, you know, she's kind of making all those pieces happen because what I'm capable of doing in the chaos of my life is just showing up for the conversation. That's like what I can do.
Yeah.
And there's just such beauty in being able to, you know, meet each other in those places. And I think that it really works when you know what really matters and what doesn't.
Right. Yeah, it was my what I loved about how we did this together is initially we started with this idea and pretty soon, the group, and then at some point realized like, well, it's not feasible right now, just the time commitment and the whatever and the dates and all the things, and just like, oh, this isn't for right now. And then we were like, well, yeah, but what's still here, and that ability to tap into like, what am I excited about? What am I willing to do for that? And do you have this? And so we did the negotiation of like, well, I only have room for this, or I can do that. And oh, this is really easy for me. I would be doing it anyway, or whatever. And so yeah, being able to not just throw everything out because somebody can't do what the original plan was, but instead to figure out what really was here and what was available or is available to us. And to go with that was an expression of that adaptability, right? Of
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
both us figuring out what our parameters were, like what we really could put into this, and then
Like
also like
Desert Mother.
sorry.
Like Desert Mother.
Yeah, exactly. And then
Yeah.
like being able to tap into that reservoir and being, well, like I'm still really excited about this. Even if we can't do that thing, I'm still really excited about this. And
Yeah.
us being like, oh, okay, how can we make that thing happen?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I just really wanted to thank you for that because we wouldn't even be here doing it if we hadn't had that conversation. And I'm just really grateful for the way that you show up in my life, um and grateful that we're doing this. This feels like it was a really rich conversation.
me too. I mean, it was for me, and I hope it was for anybody who watches. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. I so appreciate That ability to get in and be adaptable with me. It's just so nice for things not to be either or, but for each of us to be able to come with what we have and to create
Yeah.
out of it. And I
Yeah.
love that about our friendship and our relationship. And we've done it in many ways as per another conversation that we had.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I feel like just by having this conversation, I feel more resourced to go about what's on my plate right now too. Like I'm thinking about the wheel that we talked about of like
Mhm.
how I prioritize and having it rooted in my values. And as I'm trying to make decisions during this move in a real estate transition, I can kind of hold that tool as like, oh yeah, this is a useful tool to use. And also just kind of having a sense of like, oh, if I'm feeling like depleted and I'm in a harsh environment like the desert, then how can I shift that somehow to more of a forest landscape? Like those will be really good questions to be holding and inquiries to be having as I navigate a challenging time. So yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Talk to you very soon.
Bye.
Bye.